Folks, today I've got a guest with me that is probably going to be, I'll call it transformative in the business world for you. David B. Hampson, because he's an acquisition entrepreneur, a family business advocate, and really an industry thought leader. David is also the author of, let's see, it's called Rainbow Gold, building a business that's both the journey and the destination. And I think that's that important part, is building that journey and its a destination as well. So welcome, David. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to just jump right into it and ask you a question right off the bat. What is it that we sacrifice personally and maybe even culturally when we treat a business with an exit strategy, or without any meaning? Because I think a lot of people perhaps nowadays may think of building the business and selling the business rather than having it as a long-term something that's meaningful to them. Hopefully that made sense. That was a mouthful coming out of me.
Yeah, no, that was a good question. And, it is true that these days, particularly, I think the media sensationalizes, the entrepreneurship as being something you scale up to exit, and that should be the main goal. And the problem with that was a couple problems with that. One is that when that becomes a sole focus, then you're focusing on, profitability, top line revenue, which a business needs to be profitable. That's important. But then you're taking focus off of developing culture in your company, which a good culture, which is it's a long-term process. There's no quick way to develop a good culture. Very important. But that's what creates your positive environment for your business and your company. And that's what can make it a rewarding company for you, yourself as the owner, to be part of and to work in, and for your employees to be in. And it hugely affects your clients too, and that clients see that, and it affects the service that they get and how they feel about working with you too. So it also, when you're taking that shorter term approach of trying to get to an exit, you also probably are not going to take the time or put the investment in with time or money to develop your employees and try to empower them and try to get them to reach their full potential. And you're probably going to be so focused on growing and scaling fast, you're more likely to get burned out and stressed out in a way that's going to affect you emotionally and physically as well. It may affect your family life. It may affect your personal life. And you start thinking, well, if I can just get to that exit, then everything will be good after that. And hopefully that happens, but that can take may or may not work out. And in the meantime, you've not been enjoying what you're doing. And in my opinion, it's a much better to create something where you're getting personal satisfaction and financial reward while you're doing it. That way, if you don't end up exiting, or maybe you don't even want to exit, like you have a business like I do where I love it, then you're getting a lot of personal satisfaction while you're doing well financially too.
Yeah, and you mentioned culture and stuff, and a lot of times you hear companies now talk about culture, and as you said, it's difficult to build that culture, or the positive culture, if you have that initial mindset. I'm going to scale to sell. It's like a 100-yard. Can I say dash, or do I have to use meters now? But the sprint runner versus the long distance, and I think there's planning that really goes into building the best business, and you can also scale it at the same time, right?
Oh,
You can scale.
absolutely. You can still scale it. And obviously, when you're looking at the long term, you're doing it in a more strategic way. We're scaling it to be sustainable so that it's also profitable too. But, I've also seen, there's two ways to scale. I've seen businesses that trying to scale up, the expense of being profitable. I mean, I've seen business plans for companies that, 5 years later, they might be predicting $100 million in revenue, but they're still not making any money. And it's like they're hoping someone's going to be excited by the top line revenue number and want to buy them. But if they don't, then eventually they're going to fail because they're not actually making any profit. So scaling, yes, but doing it in a sustainable way, in a way that's going to, be able to make money, be able to pay for its continued expansion. So there, the different ways to scale, but scaling is important. I mean, you've got to grow. You got to look to grow when you run a business. That's important for it to be sustainable long term.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because yes, you can scale and you can look at the top line, but if that's not profitable, there's no profitability. Doesn't matter what that top line number is. Eventually, it seems like you'll crash, and you'll probably burn out, then crash.
Yeah.
because of all the additional work that you're putting in. So that leads me to ask you the question of, when you first started out and you were that young guy in the restaurant world, did that teach you anything about business or about your personal, perhaps resilience?
It taught me a lot. And I was only in my mid 20s when I had my first business experience. And I knew nothing about business. I didn't take any business courses in college or high school. I was primarily a science guy. I was studying physiology and exercise science to be specific. And, I decided to go into business. It was the influence of my wife, who's my girlfriend at the time. She was really excited about business and got me thinking about it. I'd also started running an exercise program within the Sports Science Institute where I worked. And I was in Cape Town, South Africa at the time as well. And I sort of run my own little profit center there, and I really enjoyed that. I thought about my grandparents on both sides of my family who had successful businesses, and I decided, yes, I want to go into business. That's probably going to be able to lead me to longer term financial success and be able to be something I could build. But I didn't know what business I should go into. I thought that even, at least I had the sense back then to know that I didn't have the experience and I probably needed some support. So I decided a franchise would be best because they have the systems, of course, and they provide some training and support. Obviously, restaurants are the most common type of franchise. So I found a restaurant. It was called Ocean Basket. It was for sale. The prior franchisees had moved on to being real estate brokers, and they were kind of neglecting the restaurant. The franchisor wanted to get someone new in there who was enthusiastic to be an owner operator. So, they approved me despite being probably not the ideal profile of someone they were looking for in my mid 20s and no experience. But I did training. I learned a lot, from them. But then the real learning happened when I jumped in with, both feet and started running this restaurant. And, it was like a 160 seater restaurant. We had probably 40 staff, including the different shifts we had and whatnot. And I made many, many mistakes. I mean, I had people that, had stolen from me. I was a little bit naive then. I didn't know what I didn't know in terms of getting things sorted out with getting it, even the credit card machine, because I wasn't a South African citizen. That was a big issue. And I struggled with that. I struggled with some terrible tragedy as well when the staff transport van that took the staff home at night was hit by a military vehicle and people were killed and we had to recover from that. But that was the most difficult thing that happened there for sure. And the resilience of having to recover from that situation, and then many other things too. And it wasn't extremely financially successful. I mean, I was able to eke out a living and pay the loan that I had, but it was extremely rewarding from an educational perspective. That was the wealth it gave me, was educational wealth. Things and skills that I learned there that I was later able to bring forward to my business today, and will put me on the business path that led me ultimately to the wonderful aviation insurance organization that I run today that's been very successful. And so I don't regret that first business decision at all, even though it wasn't a business that was something I was passionate about or that would have been sustainable for me for many years. It performed the foundation of education that led me to success later on.
With the tragedy and the difficulties of running a restaurant, no matter what time of year, season it is, it's got to be long, hard hours. Was there ever a moment that you wanted to walk away from all of this?
I wouldn't say walk away, but there were times when I was always very good about sticking to something I was committed to. But there are times when I thought, what did I get myself into? Why did I do this? Did I make a terrible decision? Did I make a terrible mistake? I would say that was the time when that was most a factor was right after that terrible tragedy when people had passed away. We had to close the restaurant for a period of time. I had to try to find staff to reopen. The morale was obviously terrible because everyone was in mourning and sad. And it just, I had the weight on my shoulders of responsibility for what had happened to these folks. And then having to get the restaurant open again and meeting those obligations as a business owner that was when I was like, oh, why did I do this? Why did I do this? But then, I was able to pick myself back up and realize that, this was something that as a leader, I needed to be strong for everybody else. I needed to get back open again. We needed to get through this. I didn't have a choice, and I had to, and I had to be strong in that strength that I had to, even when I didn't feel strong, that I had to force myself to have, that allowed me to get through it. And for me to realize that I could persevere through it. And, there's a lot I could learn from even that experience and how to be resilient.
I was going to just say that it almost sounds like what you talk about with the business butterfly effect, where something in your past that you did or may have learned has that ripple effect and changed your path or made it larger
Mm,
later on.
yeah.
I'm probably not really explaining that business butterfly effect very well. Can you kind of walk us through that? If anything from that younger time of owning that restaurant, if it created the ripple effect to how you run things and do things now?
Oh, absolutely, in many different ways. But one of the things I'll tell you is that some of the difficult experiences I had there, including that terrible strategy I mentioned, and having realizing I had the strength and resilience to get through that, made it such that later on, when we bought our current business, the first couple years we closed in 2015 on our aviation insurance business, and we had a couple challenging years right after we closed on it. The aviation insurance market was softening, so rates were going down. Unfortunately, we had a couple clients that went out of business, some larger ones the very first year, two large clients, and revenue dropped by like 20%. It was challenging. The if but having had the experiences that I had in South Africa with the restaurant, those challenges seem small, relatively speaking, compared to what I dealt with emotionally, psychologically, and financially there. So I thought back to South Africa experience that, this is easy. This I'll be able to get through this. This is simply a financial challenge. It didn't have the heavy weight of some of the stuff I dealt with there. So it gave me that strength and that knowledge that I had the resilience to get through what seemed like a relatively small challenge the first couple years we had the insurance business. But sometimes I think back and I think, gosh, if I didn't have that experience in South Africa, would I have been the sheltered New Hampshire boy who just threw in the towel when things got hard? That said, you know what, I better sell this now because it's difficult. I hope I wouldn't have been. But one thing I know for sure is that having that experience there in South Africa gave me this, the strength and the knowledge that I could get through it. It taught me something in resilience and perseverance that absolutely I bring with me to my business today. And there's so many other things too, like in terms of dealing with employees. Some of the stuff I learned about sales and networking, working with people skills, financial skills. Like there's so many things I learned there. That was the biggest one I mentioned, the resilience aspect of it. But like, many, many things that I bring with me today. That would just, I mean, you can't get it from an MBA, right? Like, an MBA is gives you certain knowledge, but the sort of skills I learned in that restaurant, I don't think an MBA will ever give you.
Yeah, you talk about resilience a lot. So I was wondering, did and does luck ever play or have a role in any of this stuff?
Yes, I mean, luck does have a role to play, and I think a lot of things in life, right? I mean, timing is everything. That's true. You can be at the right time. I mean, when I called the prior owner of the agency we have today, looking to see if he wanted to sell it, the aviation insurance agency we own, the timing just happened to be right. His wife had retired, and he was looking to do something, so that was lucky. But I believe that in order to be able to embrace lucky opportunities, you have to take action to find that luck, to create that luck in a way. And I found that the more you embrace opportunity, the more that you take action proactively, ironically, the luckier you get.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, with all of that, you definitely, I see the title, the heading when I said that you are an acquisition entrepreneur. Is that I've heard some people on the internet, we'll call them influencers, talk about the way to build or start a business is to acquire, be an acquisition. So how does one really go about doing that? You mentioned that with the restaurant, you started out by you found somebody that was didn't want to be in the restaurant business any longer, but that was a franchise opportunity. How do people go about? Does it make sense when I say becoming a
Yeah.
franchise
Well,
entrepreneur?
that the first step you take is the hardest because then it's kind of like, well, how do I start? How do I do this? And a couple of things you need to think about. One is, first of all, identifying the business that you want. And I didn't do a very good job initially of trying to align something that was with, consistent with my passion and my interests. And that's really important. I did recognize I needed help, so that's why I chose a franchise. But I didn't do a very good job of seeing if that restaurant model was aligned with my interest and passion. And I think that's important. Passion isn't the only thing, but it is very important for it to be sustainable. The second thing that's really important, and you really can't do as if you don't have this without as an acquisition entrepreneur, is capital, right? Because if you don't have any money to buy the business, then that's going to be a problem. And you can try to save up to buy a business paycheck by paycheck. Maybe someday you'll get there, but that's going to be a long and very difficult road. What most people do that do it successfully is that they use a very important critical tool called good debt. And they're able to take on debt. Either it might be family or friends that provide support. Could be obviously a banking partner if you can develop that relationship. Although early in your business journey, you'll probably find that getting a banking partner is challenging because banks don't like to give money to people who actually need it. That's their risk management, right? Because the more you need it, the more risky you are. But in any case, that's where family and friends can come in. And my first business experience, actually in the insurance experience too, and this is where I was fortunate as well as having supportive family. My father, provided. I didn't have, as a 25, 26-year-old, there's no way a bank was going to give me money. And my parents provided the collateral, with their retirement savings to be able to help me sign to get the loan that I was able to get to buy the restaurant and then subsequently our insurance business. And, not everybody has that, I understand, but if you do, don't be afraid to take advantage of that opportunity. And because otherwise you might not be able to do it, or don't be afraid of debt. Some people think that, all debt is bad. I can't owe people that much money because a business loan could be a big number. But if it's a business that's generating cash flow and profit, and you're able to pay the loan and then it generates profit beyond that, it's almost creating a money tree. That's an example of good debt. Very different from bad debt, like consumer debt for something like an expensive car or putting stuff on a credit card for vacation. Big difference between those two. I think sometimes people get the idea that all debt is bad. But most successful business people, even if you look at people that have a high asset portfolio of different things they own, most all of them have good debt, and it's used very strategically for most business people. So that's the other thing too, is thinking about how you're going to get the capital. Of course, you can also give up equity too. Sometimes people will get an equity partner, and you got to be really careful with that. Of course, to make sure you have the right partner. I think debt, in my opinion, debt is better than equity, but that's not a way to get capital too. But you've got to have the money. You've got to align with your passions and interests, and then you have to find the right opportunity. And you need to take time to assess each business and do a due diligence too on different businesses you find, because some businesses might look good on the outside, but when you get in and dig into the numbers, there's issues there or the price is too high. And if you don't know how to do that, that's where it really pays off to get someone who's a professional that can help you with due diligence to make sure that you're making the right decision.
I guess that comes down to, you're talking about alignment and things like that and passion. I guess people have to be aware that just because you like something does not necessarily mean that it's going to be the right business. So you really have to do your due diligence. Like I said, dig into the numbers a little bit and find out some information about it. Would that be the obvious correct path to take on that?
Yeah, and also and make sure that not only specific business you're looking at is a viable business model, but even the specific industry that you're in, or that part of the industry. Like for example, aviation is a great example of that. Now, I love aviation. I'm a pilot. I fly myself. It's something that's really my passion. And there are many businesses in aviation you can go into. And I could have said like, well, I want to buy a flight school or a charter company or something like that. Those are very capital intensive businesses, and they oftentimes run on really small margins. And it can be really a lot of them fail, and there's some that are very successful, but they're very difficult to scale up without lots and lots of capital. So I recognize that at this point in my career when I was looking at going to another business, but going to aviation insurance that had recurring revenue, it was a very unique specialization. I had insurance experience as well because I'd worked in insurance before going into that, and had a much higher likelihood of success. And I could still combine my passion. I could still use my passion for aviation, in it, and it would be part of it. I could still fly because I fly my own plane to see clients, but that was much better aligned with my experience and my likelihood to be financially successful than other types of business in aviation would have been.
Okay, that correct me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, but that would be something like, say, I love race cars. I want to be in the business of racing cars, but that's so expensive to get into. But the side thing might be the decals for the cars or something like that. So I'm still in my passion. It's just that I'm doing something else. Would that be what you're kind of?
Exactly, exactly. Like maybe you're you have a lot of experience in marketing, right? So you can leverage that experience and you can do decals and other marketing advertising for race cars, and you'll be interacting with the folks and be going to conferences. You'll still be deeply immersed in the industry, but you'll be able to get into it, in a way that it's more viable financially and more likely for you to be successful because you also have experience in that area. And that's the difference. Yes.
Uh, so let's say that you are in business now, or just maybe you're still in the pre-planning process. But how do you really balance the purpose of having that drive or that driven business with those realistic financial demands? Because, like you said, you can either go to uh, a relative or somebody and borrow money, or you can give up a stake in your business, which would be not the greatest thing according to you, or the bank, but you do have these financial demands and obligations. How do you balance everything out? I know you kind of talked a little bit about it, but can you make it obvious for us how you can really balance those things?
Yeah. Well, you need to, I think, first of all, think about what your goals are for the business as well. If your goal is to scale it up, as fast as possible, or you want to have a lot of acquisitions in a short amount of time, and that's okay. It's nothing wrong with that. You still need to make sure you're not ignoring the things I talked about, like developing culture and developing the environment within your company and empowering people and enjoying where you work. But if you want to grow relatively fast, then it probably makes more sense to take on an equity partner because they're going to be able to give you consistent capital. Private equity, for example, could help do that. And that's where the bank is going to be a little bit more of a slower process. They're not going to allow you to keep getting capital quickly from them until you've established yourself. It's going to be a slower process. So, how quickly you intend to scale and grow with more acquisitions can be a big factor in terms of weighing whether you give up equity or take on debt. So, I think that's really important to think about. I think as well, it's important to think about whether you have the ability to take on debt, because if you don't have a banking partner willing to give you money, and that banking partner could be backed by an SBA loan, and SBA loans have much lower thresholds for somebody to get in, so that can be an option to get in with a bank. But do you have family support that can help with that too? So that can also help you weigh that decision. Also, these days, I'll tell the audience that there's a couple companies out there now that I don't have personal experience with them, but they now have this model where they're helping acquisition entrepreneurs, and they have capital where they'll come in, and if you qualify, they'll help you acquire a business and they'll help you get the loan. They'll take a stake of equity too, but they'll help you with a down payment. They'll help you with get the loan, and they're going to take a piece of equity. But it's a great way for people who don't have another option, but have really good attributes, in terms of being, hard worker, having good skills, and they vet you for that, and have the potential to see you have the potential to be able to get into it. And some of them offer you the opportunity to buy them out later on, where once you're up and running, you're successful, you can then buy your equity back. And you still own a big portion of it too. So I think that's really cool. Those are companies I really admire how they're doing things, helping people get into entrepreneurship and making money for themselves too at the same time.
Are there systems or habits that you've developed, or maybe that you rely upon to help you stay aligned when things do get tough?
Some things that I think about when every time I do business, or every time I try to go back to what I learned and apply it. And I have an acronym of things that I think kind of keep you grounded in terms of what you need to always be thinking about. And the acronym is PRIMAR. And I think these critical things, if you can master them and continue to go back to them when you're not sure what to do, that will keep you on the right path. And the first one is, as I mentioned, was passion. P is for passion. So passion is obviously what gets you excited, something you're interested about, something you love. And then I said it's important. It's not the only thing, but it's important. And then the R is risk management, having a risk management mindset. And that means, each you're going to face risks in business. And especially when you're encountering challenges or difficult times, it's probably relative to something that's a risk. And you don't necessarily need to be risk adverse and avoid risks. I mean, businesses are a risky thing, right? But you need to evaluate the risk and determine whether you can accept the level of risk that the decision entails. Is that acceptable level of risk to you? And that can vary for people at different stages of their lives. And it can vary depending on how risk adverse a person is. But then once you accept the risk, what can you do to manage the risk? Are there actions you can take to make the risk less risky, essentially? Or if the worst case happens, do you have a backup plan on how you're going to handle that? So that's risk management. The I is interpersonal relationships, and that's relationships with clients, with vendors, with your employees, and that's so critical in business. They say, "Oh, it's who you know," but it really is to a large extent. I mean, if you have good relationships with people, it's amazing what you can get done. It's amazing what people will do to help you when you need help. So don't. That's something never to ignore interpersonal relationships. I've learned that over my career for sure. And then M is money sense. That's knowing accounting, knowing sales. If your business gets successful, tax strategy becomes really important. If I've seen people that are really good in a really specialized field, but they don't have very good money skills and they haven't learned that. And then they go into business and they fail, not because their business model wasn't good, but they didn't have the money, the accounting, the sales education. So if you don't have that, get it. It's important. And keep learning that all the time. Keep trying to get that education on that. I'm still learning. I've learned a lot. I still try to continue to enhance my skills in that area. So that's, and then E is environment. The other E is environment. And that's having, as I mentioned, a positive culture in your company, with your employees, and purging toxicity. Occasionally, well, if you have a business long enough, it's only a matter of time before you'll either get a toxic employee and or a toxic client. Not all clients are good clients. Early on in business, it's hard to recognize that. And, if you're desperate for business, you might want to take on everybody, but it's not worth having a client that's toxic or an employee. And so you need to purge that out and create a really positive environment where you like to work and your employees like to work. And then, so that's the E. And then R is what we talked about before, resilience, having a
Mm-hmm.
growth mindset, being able to persevere through the difficult times. That's something that I believe can be, developed over time. I don't think it's, necessarily such something you're born with. I think some people naturally are more resilient than others, but it is something that you can be coached on. You can learn to be more resilient, particularly if you face some difficult circumstances and you see that you're able to get through it. So if you're able to master all of those things I mentioned in that acronym, I think you're going to be really in a great position to persevere through any difficult time and to be successful over the long term.
Wow. Out of the acronym, I think the first R and the M is difficult for a lot of people. It's that risk management and then that money sense. I think sometimes people on both risk and money sense overshoot or undershoot. And I want to talk a little bit about if you underestimate yourself, what can happen with your business,
Well, if you
if that makes any sense about undershooting.
Yeah. So if you underestimate yourself, then you won't achieve your potential, right? So I think a lot of people, I think in general in life, in my opinion, a lot of people don't live up to their potential. And that's why, like, I love it when I have people that in our companies that work for us or that start with us. And then, one of the things I love doing is helping people achieve their potential and, do more than they ever thought that they could do. And I think that sometimes business owners too, they're making a good living in their business. It's a fairly small business and there's so much more they could do, to grow their business further. There's opportunity there, but they kind of get stuck in the status quo where especially in this day and age of technological change and all the advancements we have, AI is of course a big thing as well. And I see some business owners that just they're resistant to change that maybe they're afraid of it and they don't embrace it. And as a result, they don't achieve what they could. and they're undershooting where they could be, what they could do. Sometimes it's a confidence thing too, honestly, where they don't believe that they can. And that's another issue, and that's where having like a mentor and executive coach can help on that. But I believe that most people, if you take a look deep inside yourself, you probably realize you're not living up to your potential. I mean, I think that to myself all the time. We've been very successful, but like I'm always feeling like I can do more. Like I know there's more that I can do. I have a bigger mission, and that approach helps me, to stay on that growth mindset.
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes with like sort of like the fear, but the comfort. I mean, I'm comfortable, and then therefore I'm afraid to take a step outside of my comfort box to grow. Even though, like I said, there's that opportunity there, but I have that fear, so I don't want to risk it.
Yeah,
So I guess that's part of that risk assessment, risk management.
it is. And one other thing that just came to mind too, that's I think plays into this, is that sometimes people are, and this is the case with a lot of closely held businesses, they fear turning over too much or giving up too much. They hold a lot close to the vest. And in order to grow, you can't do everything yourself. You need to delegate, you need to develop systems, you need to turn tasks and responsibilities over to your team. You need to be willing to, in fact, look for hiring people that are maybe even better than you, that are smarter than you, and giving and empowering them to then, help you grow your business so that you can become more of an ambassador for the business, where you're there helping do business development, looking for opportunities, help focus on the bigger strategic things rather than always just rolling up your sleeves and being the key man that's doing everything. The key person that has all the institutional knowledge yourself. If you fall into that trap, and I've seen many small business owners do that, you're eventually going to get to the point where you're saturated and you just can't do anymore. And then you haven't empowered your people. So if you step away, things start to go badly and you feel like you can never even take a break, for example. And that's the trap people fall into because they're too afraid of giving up. They think the only person that can do it. And that's something you really need to spend some time working on if you're in that situation.
With that, for better or for worse, I hear a lot of people complaining about, I'm going to say some mega wealthy people saying, well, they don't know how to do any of that stuff. They're not the guy that invented or did that. But like I said, surround yourself with people who can possibly do better. And, I look at it as part of the risk management for me. The way I think is who you hire. That's part
Hmm.
of the risk. And then you manage, because if they're going to be better, but they're going to help with the bottom line growth, top line, everything, that's building a business. And again, I haven't done that, so I may be thinking about it the wrong way.
No, I think you're spot on there. Who you hire is really important. Who you identify for your team, and hopefully you make good decisions on that. I mean, we do the best we can to try to vet people before we hire them. Making sure not only are they smart, they have the knowledge, they have the work ethic, but also are they a good fit culturally for your team? If we have a certain culture where we have certain values, and we need to make sure the people that we hire are aligned with that. Otherwise, probably not going to work out. But also being willing to invest in a little bit in hiring people, like that's I see that as investment. When you have a really good person who's going to be a perfect fit for you and for your company, and they're going to help you to grow, you may need to take a step back in profitability because you're going to spend a little bit more maybe on hiring that person. But that's only a short term step back in order to achieve several steps forward in growth. And that's sometimes business owners have trouble with that, I think, in making that having expending that cost because they see as an expense without realizing it's really an investment. So that's one thing. And then, if you do make a bad decision because, sometimes it's not going to work out, you're not going to, you're going to miss something in the vetting process, or someone's not going to show their true colors until they start working for you. It's okay to admit you made a mistake. And sometimes I've seen business owners that they're still hoping it's going to work out, and they keep the person way too long. And that can be a mistake as well. Generally in our company, because of the culture we've created, I'm proud to say that usually, and it's a rare case, but when someone doesn't work out, it's usually the other team members that'll kind of rally together and tell me that, and everybody will be saying this person's not a fit for us. They're not Schrager Hampson material, and then when I finally do make the decision to terminate them, it's usually everybody just kind of has a collective sigh of relief versus saying, oh, David's the evil boss for firing people, and that's because we have that culture where everyone's aligned, and that's really cool when that happens.
Yeah. It's this might be kind of off topic, but I think people who are on the outside who generalize and shame business owners for firing individuals have to really understand that the business is there for profitability, not there to work hard and to, this may sound bad, employ people their cost, meaning at the business's cost. Because again, I believe that a business is created for profitability. You run it because you have a passion, you're in line with what you're doing, but in order to sustain it, it has to be profitable. You can't just give things away. And hopefully that's not a bad way of me thinking about a business.
No, no, that's really good insight. And sometimes people don't always realize that, especially on the outside or someone that's never been in business. But if you think about it as well, business have lots of risk, right? I have, in my business, have bank loans, and, you normally sign personal guarantees on the loans you take to buy businesses if you use debt. And, there's a huge responsibility that you have on your shoulders for your employees, to your lenders, to your clients, to your vendors. And you have all that responsibility ultimately. And someone wouldn't take on the risk of business ownership if there wasn't the possibility of outsized reward. It just wouldn't happen. Otherwise, we would just be an employee, right? And have the benefits and get rid and not have the risk, right? So in order to motivate people to be able to want to do a business, it has to provide reward, which is the profitability. The other thing that people sometimes don't understand is that by having a business be very profitable, by that I mean having a profit margin that's kind of best in class for the industry that you're in. And different industries have different profit margins, of course. But for your specific industry, having a good profit margin, that ultimately is better for your employees too, because that's going to mean that you're going to be able to get capital from lenders, because when they look at your business, they're going to look at that. They won't give you a loan if your profit margin isn't good. You're going to be able to be more sustainable through if a tough time hits and the economy goes south. By having a high profit margin, your profits might drop some, but you're already at a good level, so you'll be able to get through it. So that's going to mean that your employees are going to have more secure employment for the long term, versus if you're if you're crazy on your expenses and you just way overpay people and you're barely making it from month to month. It's not going to take much for your business to fail, and then everybody loses their jobs. So sometimes people don't think people really realize that, like how important it is for a business to have a healthy profit.
Yeah, I wish people would really understand that it takes a lot more to run a business. It's not about what we see. Oh, you charged X amount, you must be making a lot of money. And they did forget about all the overhead and other costs, insurance and everything else that it takes to run and maintain the business, let alone, like you said, in case there's hard times, you need to be able to have what just layman's term of called cushion. You need to have that financial cushion to weather anything that's bad. David, I want to remind everybody that we're having a conversation. You're David B. Hampson, and your book is Rainbow Gold, Building a Business That's Both Journey and the Destination. David, is there a website that people could go to? Anything that you have online?
Yes. My website for my book, and also to contact me regarding any speaking engagements, it's www.myrainbowgold.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because a lot of this stuff that you're talking about is really important. And I'm going to take it as a person that says, well, I'm not going to run a business or start a business or anything like that. But if I know these things, I think I understand, and I'm going to be able to not necessarily fit into the culture better, but to understand the culture that possibly that the business is running, and the whys behind certain things that are going on to build the business. Again, that might be the wrong way of thinking about things, but I think for me,
No, I
it
think you're
helps
right. I think too,
knowing.
it can be very valuable for people that are in, management or leadership positions. You might not own the business, but if you're, managing, if you're in a management role, or you may be in some sort of leadership position within a company that you don't own, I think it's really important to still understand some of these concepts I mentioned, because that will help you be a better leader.
Yes, yes. Before we close out, I wanted to find out from you if there's somebody that's watching or listening who feels that they're stuck. Maybe they're chasing success, but they're not being fulfilled. What is probably one of the first couple of mindset shifts that they need to do to see the light, to see the rainbow gold?
I think one of the mindset shifts is thinking about what's going to make you happy and fulfilled today
Right.
versus I hope I get there in the future. There's light at the end of the tunnel. I hope I finally get through to it. And if what you're doing now, there's no way that it can make you happy and fulfilled today, even if you make some changes, then think about, am I doing the right thing? And that's, you have to take a lot of courage to make a big change or a big pivot in what you're doing. But honestly, if you can't if you have to answer no to the fact that there's nothing you can do that's going to make you happy and fulfilled today, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. And life is too short. All of us only have a very limited time on this earth, and we all work. Most of us work at least 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's a big chunk of our life, and if we're not happy, that's gonna bleed into our personal life and probably make us unhappy there too. So I encourage everybody to dig deeply into that and ask themselves that question. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have to change what you're doing. There could be changes you can make to make what you're doing fulfilling and rewarding. But if there's nothing, but if you can't, then take a hard look at whether maybe you need to pivot. And it's okay. It's okay to pivot to something. I mean, I started off in exercise physiology, and then I ran a restaurant, and now I've been in the aviation insurance business we've had this company for 11 and a half years, and this is now the pinnacle of my career, and I love it. I found it, but it took a while to get there. It took a couple pivots. So, and that's okay.
Very good points. Everything that we're talking about can be found in your book, right?
Yes, yeah, all these concepts are covered well in my book, and the book is primarily about my journey. I talk about where I started in South Africa, what I learned. It is a business book, but it's also told in through my journey of what I went through in my experiences. So I hope everyone enjoys it, and if my message can just help a couple people take the step to having their own business that's personal, rewarding, and financial successful, then my book have been a success in my opinion.
I think books like yours can be set as a guide for us to read what you went through, the steps, and we can follow those steps. It may not be the exact same thing, but we can always have correlation between a restaurant or maybe own a surf shop. But you may end up having similarities as far as the difficulties of starting personnel management and things like that. So
Yeah,
books like yours, I think, are fantastic.
yeah, thank you.
Is there anything that we left out that you want to add to the conversation for the viewers?
Yeah, one more thing I'd like to mention that I think is important is, I talk a lot about, having business sustainable, not having to search for an exit. But as I mentioned, obviously we all have a limited time on this earth. So that doesn't mean that you can't think about like an end game and what it's going to be. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be selling it off, but it could be, for example, perpetuating it and creating a family legacy. You could have maybe children that want to take it over. I don't think you should pressure them to, but if they do, it's great for them to have that opportunity. It could be that when you get to the point where you want to retire, you could create an employee stock ownership program. It's basically like a retirement account, but your employees, instead of shares in publicly traded companies, the retirement account has shares in your business, and you can sell it to the ESOP and get a market valuation for it, and then perpetuate to your employees a legacy that you created together, which is really cool. Or you could find somebody who's a young entrepreneur like you, acquisition entrepreneur like you were, who has a similar values as you, and perpetuate to them. There's lots of ways that you can think of to perpetuate your business, but I encourage people still to think about that, because not scaling to exit doesn't mean you don't still develop a perpetuation plan. And I think that's important.
David, I want to say thank you very much for filling us in on everything about being an entrepreneur, acquisition entrepreneur, just really the basic business sense, because I definitely have learned quite a bit of new things. And, definitely will look at how I align myself, how I do my risk management, and my money sense. Definitely. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chuck. I really enjoyed being on your show.
You're welcome.